Evolve Mentoring. We're a nonprofit that teaches life skills to youth and young adults. We lead the My Brother's Keeper initiative. For those of you who don't know or new joining us here to our Lunch and Learn, welcome and welcome back. Those who are new to joining us for our Lunch and Learn, I'm really excited about this one. The one that we're doing today is so fits the times. As I was saying, My Brother's Keeper is an initiative started by President Obama in 2014 to close the achievement gap for boys and young men of color, Black, Latino, and Native American boys and young men. As of this year, the national initiative has shifted to include girls and young women. So My Brother's Keeper is now My Brother's and My Sister's Keeper. So we're excited to be a more inclusive and expansive organization. Today we are with WeAre talking about implicit bias. I'm so grateful to do this workshop again. The first one was amazing. So thank you again, Dr. Bullock, for taking the time to join us again to walk us through this as we grow, speaking on topics that are really, really important to us today. So I'm gonna pass it off to, well, let me introduce our team. We have Minnie Mcmillan. She is our Manager of Outreach and Engagement. And we have Khalid Scott, who is our Manager of, Minnie Mcmillan, who is our Manager of Data and Analytics. I apologize. And Khalid Scott, who is our Manager of Outreach and Engagement. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to kick it off to Minnie so she can introduce our amazing presenter with this important issue.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you guys' faces and just being here in this moment, being present with us. We're so excited to have you all. For some of you all joining us again, and for others, welcoming you all to our Lunch and Learn today. And we're so excited to have Dr. Bullock, who's amazing on this topic with her many, many years of experience here. And we are so grateful. We are the program Work to Extend Anti-Racist Education. It's in Durham. And so Dr. Bullock has been doing expansive research on this and has been doing various sessions on topics related to biases in not only education, but in organizations as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass the virtual mic to Dr. Bullock. Thank you again. And if you guys give a round of applause for Dr. Bullock, a virtual one, a reaction.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be with you all here today. You know, last time we were in the pandemic and we were talking about being in two pandemics, the COVID pandemic and a racism pandemic. And so, you know, I'm just grateful that each of you are here in the midst of all of us processing and handling so much of what is going on in the world. As Minnie said, my name is Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock. I am the co-founder and executive director of WeAre. WeAre stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. At WeAre, we provide anti-racism trainings for children, families, and educators. We use a three-pronged approach to dismantle systemic racism in education and beyond by offering summer camps for kids in rising first through fifth grade, professional development for educators, and workshops for parents and families. And so today, you all will be participating in what we call a Speak Up training. And we're challenging, again, implicit and explicit biases. Today's curriculum comes from Teaching Tolerance. Some of you may be familiar with this organization or you may not be, but Teaching Tolerance is an organization that produces a lot of curriculum and material for folks to use, it's particularly in education, to further anti-racism efforts with parents, communities, and schools. And so we pull from their curriculum to do the workshop for today. Before we jump in, I'm going to share, I know some of you have been on the session before, or you've been in a workshop with me before, and some of you may not have. I see some new faces. So I'm going to share a little bit of information about just some other programs that WeAre does, and then we're going to hop in, okay? All right, there we go. So the first one that I want to share with you all is an opportunity to save the date for Friday and Saturday, March 19th through 20th. This is going to be 2021. If things are back to where we can have in-person meetings, we'll be hosting at this Let's Talk Racism conference. If you notice, this flyer here is from this year, but unfortunately we had to postpone. And so we do an annual conference called Let's Talk Racism. We co-host this event with North Carolina Central University School of Education, the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke, and Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And so because we had to cancel this year, we're basically going to we're just going to redo this one for 2021. And so our keynote will be Cheryl Matias, Dr. Cheryl Matias, and she's going to be talking about becoming anti-racist educators. While our target audience is educators, we have people from all backgrounds and all walks of life who attend. So we welcome you all and your participation. We even welcome my brother's keeper to do to lead a breakout session if that's something you all are interested in doing. But please save the date.
That would be awesome.
Two other events. So we do some annual events for educators. One, which some of the people on the call today participated in, happened back at the end of June. We do a 3-day Educator Institute. And so we bring, again, primarily educators, but folks from all walks of life together to learn about how racism is structural and how it intersects with our educational system. And we encourage folks to come in teams of 3, because we spend time in the afternoon in those teams naming a systemic racial inequity issue in their local context. And we kind of support the teams to develop a plan to address it once they go back to their local context. This year, we were able to do it for the first time ever, 3 full days virtually. It went fairly well, and we're just excited to be able to offer that again. In the fall, we have a 2-day curriculum workshop. And we get a lot of ask about how are you all having anti-racism conversations with young kids? And so we decided to do the 2-day event where we bring folks to us, share our anti-racism framework, and then also share the curriculum that we use in our summer camp. And then we want to support folks, parents, educators, and community members as they go forth and share and teach and implement this anti-racism curriculum. And then here is the flyer for our summer camp from this year. Like many other summer programs, we canceled this summer for safety reasons. But our summer camp is definitely one of our highlights. We're very sad that we couldn't offer it, but we do an anti-racism camp for kids in 1st through 2nd grade for 1 week, and then for kids in 3rd through 5th grade for another week. This summer, we were set to host 2 camps in Durham and 2 in Greensboro. And between the 4 camps, we were gonna have about 150 children. And so we get excited about parents who and community members and families who are committed to raising anti-racist children. We use a literacy-based approach in camp. And so we find age-appropriate books that help kids think about race, racism, skin color, and activism so that they can have these conversations in age-appropriate ways. And those are pics of some of our kids from last summer. Before I jump into doing the norms, I forgot I left a slide out. Something that we believe is very important is that we connect community. And anytime we come together, we need to know who all is in the room, okay? So something that I would like for us to do, let's see, and it looks like there's 13 of us. We'll break off into 2 small groups. And what I'd like for us to do is to go into those small groups and introduce yourselves. Say your name. And actually, Minnie, can you type this in the chat box too? Because, you know, sometimes when we get to small groups, we're like, oh, what are we supposed to do? Thank you. If you'll say your name, what's your role? What is your role here? What is your role in the community? And then what do you bring into this space? Okay, so what is your name? What is your role? And what do you bring into this space? So I'll model it and go first. My name is Rhonda Taylor Bullock. I am the co-founder and lead curator of WeAre. And today I am bringing disruptive peace. That is what I'm bringing to this space, okay? So I'm gonna put us in to 2 small groups, introduce yourselves, and let's build community. Another reason why we do this is because research shows that as we are in closer relationship with folks, our biases are least likely to come into play, okay? So I'm gonna go to groups. See my window. Yeah, we'll do 6, okay? Actually, I'm gonna do a little bit smaller. We'll do 3 groups. There we go. All right. So when something should pop up to say accept invitation to a breakout room, and you all just click on that box, and then we'll go in there. We'll be in there for about 5 or 6 minutes just to ensure everyone gets to introduce themselves, okay? All right, your invitation should be up.
Lord, I ain't got my glasses.
Sorry, I do not see an invitation.
I see group norms.
Oh,
Okay.
there we go.
Yep, it just popped up.
Now I see it.
Okay, good. Mhm. Oh, you're on mute.
Would it be possible if I can get into a group without like Khalid or my boss?
You know, I just saw that. I was like, ooh, let me spread you out. Okay, so you were just in the room with.
Kalulape and Heather and
All right, so I'm gonna move you to breakout room 3.
okay. Let's see, breakout room. Let me.
All right, we're waiting for everyone to come back. I think that's all of us. I think we're all here. So before we jump into practicing and learning more about what it means to speak up, it's important that we ground ourselves in norms. Each of us are carrying different stories as it relates to talking about explicit and implicit biases, as it relates to talking about racism. Some of us are carrying stories as victims. Some of us are carrying stories as perpetrators. And some of us everywhere in between. And so it's important that we bring our most thoughtful selves into this space. So I'm gonna try to go over these pretty quickly before we jump in. So first we wanna practice deep listening. And what that means is we're gonna listen and ask questions to understand rather than to respond to people. We're gonna try not to interrupt one another. We're gonna practice step up, step back. You all are gonna be in small groups for a significant proportion of today. And so if you haven't said anything in your small group, we want you to step up, all right? And if you've been talking a lot in your small groups, or even when we come back together, we want you to practice stepping back and allowing others to join the conversation. We want you all to be present. And ways to do that is to be mindful of reactions to the content and dialogue, like how does this feel in your body? Check our defensiveness when it arises and make space to listen, right? We want to utilize gracious honesty as we're engaging in this conversation. We want folks to say what you mean. Consider your purpose in sharing when you're talking. Avoid generalizations about groups of people, and one of the ways to do that is to use I statements. We want to assume the best intentions while also maintaining a focus on outcomes and impact, because our impact is greater than what our intentions were. And then lastly, we want to be open and willing to learn. And ways we can do that is expect and lean into discomfort. And what we tell people is if you find yourself feeling uncomfortable, you can pinpoint that by rubbing your ears, tapping, press down on the seat of your chair, get grounded, feel the weight of your body, and ask yourself, what about this is making me uncomfortable? Then we want you to lean into that discomfort because that's the place where transformational learning will occur. We want to allow constructive friction. We want to expect and accept a lack of closure. As I told you all last time and every time, you know, doing anti-racism work and deepening our understanding is a lifetime commitment. It's not a checklist of things that we get to do and then we're done with it. And then lastly, relinquish the feeling to critique the presentation and instead focus on the content. Like, we're not above receiving feedback, and we hope that you all definitely share feedback. But if you're doing that in the midst of the presentation, you're kind of missing the content, okay? Anyone have something that you think we should add to it? You can unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. And if not, we'll keep going. And if something arises, we can definitely go back and revisit it. So as I said before, we're going to be learning and practicing 4 ways to speak up. Again, this curriculum comes from teaching tolerance in their speak up. And so how many of you all have ever been in a situation where your body told you, you know, something is not right? This comment that was made, oops, let me go back. I'm trying to get where I can see all of you all. This comment wasn't right. It was sexist. It was racist. It could be homophobic or anti-LGBTQ. It's something about your body tells you this isn't right. And then how many of us ever thought about it for so long, we kind of missed the opportunity or we didn't say anything about it? Yeah, almost all of us, almost all of us. And so one of the ways that we believe as an organization is that those moments will never stop. You're going to have some, you might have some later today. It might be one in the session. We never know. And so we believe that being better prepared for those situations will help you all. And so today we're going to share 4 ways to show up verbally when something like this happens. Please note that most of these ways of showing up are when a situation is implicit. Like, it's hard to tell whether or not someone has said something inappropriate. Some of these can be appropriate when it's explicit, but oftentimes explicit, you know, you never know how your body's going to respond, especially when someone is intentionally trying to cause harm, right? But we just want you all to know there's multiple ways to show up verbally, but I don't need to teach you all 1,000. I'm going to teach you 4. We like to say that these ways model calling people in versus calling people out. But that does not mean that every once in a while somebody needs to be called out. It's just that we're not going to teach you how to do that, right? We're teaching you in ways, because oftentimes these happen with friends, with colleagues, when you're hosting a workshop, and it's a lot of layers and a lot of power at play. But we still need to be responsible for pushing back, even in those situations, right? So again, these are 4 ways to pull people in versus calling people out. And again, I put that caveat that sometimes you do need to call people out because it is so blatantly horrible, right? So I just want to make sure that you all understand that. So what we're going to do is, and Minnie, if you'll go ahead and link in the chat box, we have a handout that you all will be using for today. And so Minnie's going to link it. And once it's in the chat box, I want you all to click on it. What's on my screen will also be, it'll look differently, but it'll be on the handout.
And I dropped the link in the chat, so if everyone can see it, just give me a thumbs up. Cool.
Okay, people have it. All right, and if you don't mind, I'm going to ask for some verbal participation. And I want you to look at what's on, so it should look something like this. I want you to look at what's over under Appendix A on that side. And it should say, I am a person who will speak up against bias, Appendix A for students. Because you can use this in schools, and you can also change some of the language up to fit whatever context you're working in, but it is designed for an educational space. So what I'd like for, if someone wouldn't mind unmuting themselves and just read, what does it mean if you show up as an interrupter? And you can read it straight off the handout. If you're an interrupter, read that description for us. It looks like Betsy, you're about to start talking. Would you mind unmuting?
There.
There we go.
That better? There we go. So speak up against every biased remark, every time, in the moment, without exception. Think about what you'll say ahead of time so you're prepared to act instantly. Try saying, I don't like words like that, or that phrase is hurtful.
Thank you. Speak up against every biased remark every time. Now, the caveat to that is that I tell people of color, it's almost always been our job to speak up. And I say, do it as your health permits, because that is exhausting to be that person of color, to always feel like it's on your shoulders, right? And so, but the takeaway is everybody, we have to speak up. If our body told us it was wrong, we need to make it clear in that space that this is inappropriate, right? We have to say something. So one of the ways you can do that is saying, I don't like words like that, or that's hurtful. That's just enough to disrupt that space to let people know, okay, this is problematic. We all need to be checking this. Just enough to let people know I'm not okay with what was just said. That was hurtful. And sometimes that's enough. It disrupts that moment. It disrupts that power that's at play. Makes people a little uncomfortable, right? It makes people uncomfortable when you have to do that. The second one, if you show up and you ask a question, will someone unmute yourself and read that one for us?
I can read it, Rhonda.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, question. Ask simple questions to find out why the speaker made the offensive comment and how you can best address the situation. Try asking, why do you say that? What do you mean? Or tell me more.
Ask a question. We need to ask questions because we don't always know what's behind a person's comment. And we might assume they meant one thing and they could be thinking they were communicating something completely different. That's why it's important to ask a question and not to assume. So saying, well, why did you say that? What did you mean? Can you tell me a little bit more about, I'll give you an example of when we had to do this. So I was doing a PD with a group of educators in Hillsborough, and I had a white woman educator who said, you know, a parent emailed her, a white male father emailed her, and she has been doing like social justice work in her classroom. And the white male father in an email said, I don't want my son coming home talking like he's from East LA. I saw some faces, I saw some reactions there. Tell me, unmute yourself and tell me, what do we stereotypically think of when we hear East LA? Unmute yourself and say it out loud or type it in the chat box.
Violence.
Violence.
Hispanic, folks of Hispanic origin.
People from Latinx, Hispanic background.
Gangs.
Gangs. Are we people who are wealthy or people who are not wealthy?
Poor.
Not wealthy.
Not wealthy, poor, poverty, violence, Black and brown people. But did the person say that?
No.
Yes, they did. Indirectly, they did.
But technically, this is my lawyer hat. I don't have a lawyer background, but I felt like in my other life I was a lawyer. My lawyer hat says that's not what's in the email. The email said, I don't want my child talking like he's from East LA. So what I did, we can make all these assumptions, but at the end of the day, the father said what he said. So what I told the teacher was, I said, have you ever been to East LA? And she said, no. I said, will you reply back to the father and you say, I have never been to East LA. Will you tell me more about what you're trying to say? Because at the end of the day, if she says, okay, I won't do this, he's playing on her biases.
Yeah.
Because that was her understanding, right? So even though we subconsciously, we know, I saw the headlines, we know what he was trying to say. We think we know, right? But if she accepted it, that's on her. Those are her biases coming into play, not his, those are hers, right? So when she pushes back with that question, either that parent is gonna dig themselves deeper in the hole, right? Or they're not gonna respond, or they might try to explain away something that probably doesn't make sense. Either way, it's most important that that teacher communicated, I'm not about to hold your biases that you try to communicate in this email. And that's enough. That's enough. In that moment, that's enough. And that's why, well, tell me more, because otherwise we're making assumptions, and that's on us. Okay, so ask a question. The third one, educate. Someone please unmute yourself and read educate for us.
I'll read it. Educate, explain why a term or phrase is offensive. Encourage the person to choose a different expression. Hate isn't behind all hateful speech. Sometimes ignorance is at work, or lack of exposure to diverse populations. Try saying, do you know the history of that word?
Thank you. Hate isn't behind all hateful speech. Probably 90% of it. But hate isn't behind all of it, especially with, raise your hand if you work with children. Your interactions at some point, we're more likely to give kids the benefit of the doubt, right? And that doesn't mean all kids are innocent, but particularly with young children, sometimes they don't always understand what it is that they are saying. And even some adults don't know, which doesn't, that doesn't have them to escape culpability of their actions, right? But sometimes we have to show up, we have to educate. Do you understand? Do you understand what you're saying? Well, let me tell you, right? I will also add that we have someone on our team who's from Mumbai, India. And so she went to a Racial Equity Institute training, REI. Some of you might be familiar with it. And if you've done, I see some head nods. If you've done REI, you know they do this visualization where they talk about railroad tracks. And so our team member who grew up in Mumbai was like, the whole railroad tracks thing was going over my head. I didn't understand. But if you grow up in America in the South, what do railroad tracks indicate? Somebody unmute yourself. What are some hidden messages about railroad tracks? What do they represent?
Divisiveness.
Divisiveness. What else?
Being on the right side or the wrong side.
Right side or wrong side? Let's be a little more specific there. Who's on the right side?
What those
white people.
Yeah.
White people, wealthy people on the right side. Wrong side of tracks, we're Black and brown, people living in poverty. Don't be on the other side of the tracks after the sun goes down. You know, we understand that, but because that wasn't her context, it was going over her head because she's not from here, right? And so that's why we have to educate, okay? And I'll do the last one for the sake of time. The last one says echo. If someone else speaks up against hate, thank her and reiterate her anti-bias message. One person's voice is a powerful start. Many voices together create change. Try saying, thanks for speaking up, Allison. I agree, that word is offensive and we shouldn't use it. I don't know how many of y'all have ever sat and thought before you decide to speak up. It is really hard. For some people, when they finally get the courage and they get their words together to say something, how affirming would it be to have someone else in the audience say, Gladys, I heard the same thing. Thank you for speaking up. That is a sexist remark. That is a racist remark. Jasmine, you're not alone. I heard that too. It's so affirming to have someone else let you know it wasn't just you. This is problematic. Now, the one thing that I will say here is that you don't want to speak over the person who spoke up, particularly if it's a person of color. You don't have to speak over them. Just affirm, I heard you and I agree. Can we talk about this? And that's how we disrupt the power of whatever that comment was or that action was in that moment. Okay? So it is, I just want to say that it's really hard, particularly when you're at a faculty meeting or you're at a board meeting or you're working with parents or you're working with the students. It is really hard to get the courage to say something in the moment. And so it's just really important that we affirm those people when you know something in your body told you that this was wrong too.
Hey, Rhonda.
Uh-huh.
There's a question in the group chat. It says, what do you mean by speak over them? And thank you for asking that question, Margaret.
Thank you. What I mean is it's not necessary, like when you're affirming that person, to now go on a longer monologue and explanation, because oftentimes, and I say this from the perspective of a person of color, because oftentimes when we speak up or someone feels like they want to show up on our behalf, their voice is louder and they center themselves. This is particularly what white people traditionally have done. And so that's why I say you don't have to speak over them, or you don't have to over explain and then now provide all of this history. So as we're doing this, we do have to filter our responses through our own racial identity. And for those of you who were with us before, we kind of did some racial identity mapping. And so parts of our identities carry power. And so particularly for white folks, when you want to echo, be extremely thoughtful about how you're just affirming that person and not speaking over them. We get a lot of feedback, and I see someone else's hand raised. We get a lot of feedback from educators. We do some caucusing, and we ask them, what is it that you want your white colleagues to know? And one of the things they tell us is we want our word to be enough. When we tell a colleague something, we always have another white colleague will follow up and say the exact same thing we said, and then that person's voice is heard. But when the person of color experienced it, they didn't. And so that's one of the reasons why we talk about, you know, don't speak over them, just affirm what they said and then keep it moving. Does that make sense? I saw another hand was raised. Keelan?
Yes, hi, it's Kellen.
Kellen, thank you for correcting me.
That's okay, Rhonda. So thank you for this. My question is let's just use a board meeting as an example. And somebody says something. Is there a time, like if you don't speak up in the moment, that you could pick up the phone and call that person later and say, like, what's the balance of that? You know, what's more effective, I guess? It sounds like you're suggesting it be in that moment in a group setting versus in private. Could you speak to that?
I can. Thank you so much. That almost always comes up. So one of the things that you have to think about, your goal should be to speak up in the moment. And then if the moment passes, because we sat there and we thought about it, or maybe it didn't stand out to us. How many of y'all have ever been in a meeting and then a day later, you're like, wait a minute, that person say that? I think that is what that person said. And so you didn't do it in the moment. The goal should be to, like, if you train yourself to speak up in the moment, if now you have to wait until the next time or do a personal phone call or do an email afterwards, that's okay, because you're still able to speak up. One of the things that's important about speaking up in the moment, particularly if you're working in a group, but even more particularly if you're working with children, our silence communicates volumes. Because if there's the target of discrimination, if they're in there, and particularly if it's a young child, and we as the adults don't speak up, that young child that was a target will think, oh, it must not be that bad because the teacher didn't say anything, or the adult or the mentor didn't say anything. So maybe it was me. Maybe I am whatever that derogatory comment is. But also for the person who was the perpetrator, they're affirmed because nobody challenged them. And if you're working with young children, the other children watching will think, well, maybe I should go and tell this joke. Or maybe I should say this inappropriate thing, because it appeared that no adult in the room said anything about it. And even when we're working with all adults, such as at a board meeting, you don't know a person's story. And you don't know who in that room was impacted and how they were impacted by it. And it might have been silenced because it was traumatic for them. And so it is important that even if we miss the opportunity in that moment, to follow up with a whole group that heard it, so everybody in that group knows something about this is problematic. Heather, you unmuted. Thank you for that comment. Heather, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
Well, my experience whenever I was working, and I have not worked in 10 years, but and I was the diversity person. I had that position, I want to say more than 10 years. What I consistently found was if you didn't speak up in that moment just the right way, it would be denied. And later on, whenever you decided to address it, then easily you were the person that was problematic and not the for instance. And I just saw that time, and that's what people kept coming to me with. It's like, look, they tell us to speak up, and whenever we do speak up, then they turn it around on us. And what I would always emphasize to them is you've got to seize the moment without setting a fire.
And also when you're in that group setting, hopefully there's someone else in that room who can speak up in that moment, and now you have a coalition of voices versus your single voice. But again, exactly. I say sometimes we do miss the moment, but that doesn't mean we give up. It's okay to follow up. It's okay to reply all and say, yesterday something happened and I think we should talk about it. It's okay to do that. I've done that several times. I'm a little bit better about being in the moment, but I still have to be like, okay, I need to send a follow-up because that didn't go well. All right. So
Can I ask a question about the speaking over?
Go ahead, Betsy.
So I understand the intent of not speaking over, not over explaining when you try to speak up as an ally. Where do you find the balance between if you are in an obvious circumstance where that voice is not heard or where that voice is being ignored, that you can push the envelope a little bit, like to create more space for their idea or their thought or their whatever to be heard? I feel like there are times and circumstances when the ally voice perhaps is the only one that's going to be listened to. And so I'm trying to figure out the balance between trying to allow space for other voices, right? To be an ally, but not over an ally. But yet when it's obviously being ignored, how do you push it forward?
No, that's a really good question. So one of the things that I will say for that one is to say exactly what you just said. In this moment, I recognize that we are not respecting Sabrina's voice. I'm not going to speak for Sabrina. Sabrina can speak for herself, but I just want to make that clear that we need to pause and listen. And so those are ways that you can do it. And then and just say, you know, Sabrina, were you trying to say anything else? And then also you can always follow up. So some of this will come out once y'all get into the role play, but you can also always follow up with whoever the target was or the person being spoken over afterwards and ask, is what I did okay? Did I say enough? Did I say too much? You can always follow up with that person to check in to see how they're doing. So Lulu, what you about to say?
Yeah, I remember, I call it my former life, when I was in corporate America working for Noah Rubbermaid. But a lot of the people who were people of color in that company would find themselves in positions where we would either be having to bite our tongues because we heard a very racist comment said in front of us, or, you know, we were treated a specific kind of way that was different from our colleagues. And I do want to say that it's important, or even in a meeting, right? You have an idea, nobody hears you, or the idea is tossed aside, and then your coworker, a couple of voices later, says the exact same thing you said, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea." Like, you know, yeah, why wouldn't we think of that? You know, things like that definitely happening. I think the best thing to do, what I wish, when I was in those roles, I would say, and even now, when I'm going to speak for myself, but I would say that I feel comfortable speaking for others, is saying that amplify that person's voice, like amplify the fact that they're not, like I said, speaking for them, but amplifying the fact that, hey, make room, you know what I'm saying? Use your power or your privilege to make room for that person, especially when you see that they're being kind of shut out, you know, even if it's just opening the gap saying, hey, no, she actually had a really good idea, this, you know, this, that, and the other. What were you saying? You know what I'm saying? To kind of like affirm that voice, amplify that voice, and be like in that space. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, and that's it. And because we've all been in those situations, and maybe in coming in with a little more intentionality in those meetings, and think about your colleagues of color, particularly women, because now you have this intersection of race and gender dynamics at play. And particularly for those of us in power positions, what does that look like to when you hear your colleague of color, knowing that this is a theme? Again, that's a pattern that colleagues, Black and brown colleagues, say all the time when we do that caucusing, that always comes out, to say, hey, you know, I heard Jasmine's comment. This is a really good idea. Can we stay here for a little bit longer and keep talking about it? So similar things. So y'all already doing some of the breakdown and reflection pieces. So what we're about to do, we're going to get in groups of probably 3. Yeah, so there'll be at least 4 of us in each group. And you're going to assign some roles. One person's going to be a reader. One person will be the reporter. One person will be the recorder. Okay. What you're going to do is, as you need to reread Appendix A, because that's the 4 ways to speak up. Okay. Then you're going to choose 2 scenarios from Appendix B to talk through role play as a group, you have to first choose scenarios labeled with the 3 stars. Okay, so if you look at your packet for a second, there's some scenarios that have 3 stars beside them. I'll tell you those, I had to manipulate the document, add those 3 stars, because the 3 stars specifically address some type of racial issue, right? I'll tell you, when I did this training 2 times, and I sent people off, and then they come back, and people were not discussing the ones that dealt with race at an anti-racism training, right? Where we're unapologetically doing anti-racism work and trying to dismantle white supremacy. They wouldn't talk about it because it was too uncomfortable. So I'm telling you all to choose the one with 3 stars, okay? Do at least 2. And as you're doing them, you need to use at least 2 ways to speak up for each scenario, okay? If you finish early with the 2 scenarios, allow you all as a group, share one of your real life experiences, and then you all talk through it, because we all have them. We all have what we recognize. But again, your scenario should be related to race or racism, all right? And then you all role play something that you actually experienced. But again, start with 2 scenarios, because when we come back, we want to hear how you all handled each, like some of you may choose the same scenario. We want to hear how different folks handled those common ones first before you all go into, you know, share something that you all had experienced. When I say role play, I mean, what I don't mean is for you to say, I would ask a question. I would educate. You need to get in the habit and practice of saying what you will actually say, because as your brain begins to form those thoughts and they come out your mouth, you're going to be more likely to use them moving forward. So as someone reads the scenario and you all have, you know who's who in the scenario, go ahead and ask the actual question you would ask, and then you all respond to it. How many times do you get to ask a question and then the conversation ends? Oh, we solved it. That's not, I promise you, that's probably not what's going to happen in the real, when we get outside of the role play. So give each other some healthy pushback, and make your brain have to sit with, okay, I got to respond. What are you going to say? The more we practice it, the more prepared we're going to be the next time something like this happens. Okay? Any questions before we begin? Give me a second. I want to link, let me escape out of here. I want to link the PowerPoint into the chat box so that you all can have access to the directions. Y'all get to see all of my, oh no, you can't see it. I'm gonna copy my link. Give me a little second. Got to give you all permissions, because Google has put in this top flight security over here. And you have to give you all, I have to give you all permission. So here's a link to the slideshow. So you all, have it, use it as you see fit. But the directions are in there, because oftentimes when I send people to small groups, it's like, what are we doing again? So that you all, each of you can have access to the slide and see what it is that you all are doing in your small groups. Any questions before I put you all in those groups? So we're going to spend about 13 minutes in these groups and role play. And again, literally go through it. Say what you're going to say. Don't say, I would ask a question. No, what is the question you would ask? And then say it. And then y'all feedback as if it was a live situation. All right. So I'm going to go to breakout rooms. Let's see. And I may have to move. Once you get in your rooms, I'm going to look and see where people are. So I'm going to try to real quickly move some folks around so that you all can get in there. I'm actually going to change. I'm going to change them so they're a little bit smaller. We're going to do 3 to 4 participants. Okay. So I'm recreating the rooms. I'm opening them. And again, if you're in there with too many people that you want to be in a different one, come back out and I'll place you in another one. Okay. I'll wait here before I go in and I'll just be popping in and out of people's rooms. Okay. Actually, I'm gonna close all these. Sorry, y'all, I hit the wrong button. I hit the wrong button. I'm gonna take two. And it closed all the breakout rooms. Sorry, y'all.
That is all right. No problem.
Give us a second for everybody. You went in and jerked you right back out.
No problem. We're all learning. We're still all learning Zoom.
Yes.
Definitely.
Just being patient with each other.
It's a process.
It is. Yesterday, we were doing a session and the host, their internet shut down.
Oh.
Why we were supposed to be transitioning to breakout rooms. And we were like, you know, this is perfectionism is, oftentimes we say perfectionism is aligned with like white supremacy and you have to be perfect. And we're like, you know, none of us are. And it's okay to be flexible. And we can learn, we're learning by doing. And so we're gonna try this again. All right. Here we go.
Hello. I was put in with Khalid and Minnie.
Okay, so I moved Minnie. I see Khalid. All right, so I'm going to put you in breakout room 3. It's Gladys, Heather, Kellen, and Margaret.
That works for me.
Okay. And you may have to click on the breakout rooms thing at the bottom. It may not pop back up like it did last time.
How do I do that?
Let's see.
Oh, I see it. I see it.
Okay.
I got it.
Hello. Oh, I cannot hear.
I'll move you to a breakout room. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And you just have to accept it. Do you see it pop up on the screen?
Not yet.
You might have to go down to the bottom where it says breakout rooms, or it might say
Join breakout room.
Mhm.
Got it. Thank you so much.
No problem. Welcome. We're just waiting on everyone to come back. We have one more group that's still going. All right, I think we're all back. Before we start doing our share out, what I'd like for you to do is to use the chat box. And I want you to sit for a second in your body and tell me what was the experience, what did it feel like in your body to engage in that role play, to have to think, to have to challenge, to have to process how you were going to show up and what role you were playing. It could be one word, it could be a sentence. How did it feel in your body? What were you thinking? What were you experiencing as you were in those role play situations? Important yet nervous, indignant. Some people felt uncomfortable. Some people felt anxious. Another anxious person. It was difficult to put myself in the mind of someone saying overtly racist things. But it's important to do something, to do so sometimes. It's important to see that and to do some things, to respond. So I'm curious to hear, I was able to pop in and out of everyone's group. And if you're still thinking about, your response, feel free to go ahead and type it in there. Some people said they were curious on how to grow, learn to be a better bystander in those situations. Someone said, I was angry and defensive. Defensiveness, oftentimes, especially when you're challenging someone, defensiveness is always like the go-to to people who listen to respond versus to understand. And defensiveness is one that always pops up. Hard to put my own implicit bias aside. Embarrassed because it felt very familiar to be a bystander in these situations. Wow. So let's walk through. So what we're going to do is each group, we'll probably have enough time for each group to share at least one scenario that they talked through. And so the reporter's job is we want you to share the scenario you all did. You might have to tell us what page it's on so we can flip it. And if you'll read the scenario and then just tell us your takeaways. Like, did someone come up with a really good question? Did someone come up with a really good way to interrupt? Like, what are the key takeaways? You don't have to go through the whole conversation. And also tell us, what was something y'all struggled with? Was it a struggle for you to have this? And what about it was that struggle, okay? So if a reporter could go, and I'm just gonna volunteer if you don't mind, for the sake of time, group 2. See, I thought I was gonna say group 1, didn't, but group 2. With someone from group 2, if you're the reporter, again, share out the scenario, read the scenario y'all did, tell us what page it's on, read it for us, and then give us some of those key takeaways.
Okay, I think we're group 2. Kind of. Okay, so our scenario, and we're in Appendix B. On page, I'll just go with page, it's at the, no, I can't find it, sorry. Okay, page 50, Appendix 50, and there was a situation where it said, during an informal chat, a parent offers to hire a bunch of illegals to paint your classroom. And we talked about, you know, it's an opportunity to educate this person about like who is legal, who isn't legal. And, you know, we specifically mentioned that, you know, unless the speaker was Native American, at some point their ancestors immigrated to this country as well. And, you know, maybe asking them to dig deep to explain and expose what they mean. Like, why would you, you know, why can't we hire these people, something like that. And just the class issues as well there, that people expect the work to be cheaper and it's less valued, that we're talking about people who don't have rights and no one will stand up for them. And I mean, a response I was considering, which I'm not sure if it would work, would just be to say like, well, wouldn't that make you illegal since that's a crime? You know, hiring people who are unauthorized to work in this country is a crime. And if that's the hypocrisy there, that, you know, saying, well, they came into this country illegally, so they're illegal. But if you're committing a crime too, then you're also illegal. I don't know if that.
Second right there, Jennifer, let's go with that question. So someone says, why don't we hire a bunch of illegals to paint your classroom? And so the question that you pose, well, if you do that, won't you be illegal too? So one of the things that I want to say, yes, so part of that we want to keep, part of it I want to shift a little bit as we're calling people in, because it's like one stance, and again, this is not, I'm not saying there's one right way to respond, but if we're thinking about pulling that person in, I would encourage us to use a collective pronoun. Well, if we hired that person, wouldn't we be doing something illegal? That's a great question to ask, because it is true. Well, because it literally is illegal to knowingly hire people who are undocumented, right? That is a statute in our country. So on that terms, you flipped it. You've made it clear in this way that's pulling that person in. Well, that would make us illegal if we chose to do this, right? So in that moment, you've disrupted that power flow to let that person know, I'm not going to be okay with what happened right here. Did anyone, did you want to add anything else? Because I want to see if other groups did that one too. Anything else you want to add there, Jennifer?
No, I think that's it for that scenario.
Did another group do that one? You did? Margaret, can you share about, you know, some things that maybe you all would have added or something you might have said? Oh, you got to unmute, Margaret.
The responder started by actually being nice to the person who had said this by saying, Thank you for keeping the economics of the school in mind, but I'm really uncomfortable with your use of the word illegal. So it diffused the situation a little bit by not just calling them out in the sense of, you know, that's wrong, you shouldn't have said that, it's a bad thing to do, but it was a very Southern thing to do, I thought, to say, you know, it's nice of you to think this way, but I'm very uncomfortable with your terminology.
Yeah, and make sure, and thank you for saying it. So I appreciate you thinking about the economics of the school. And I'm very uncomfortable with your use of that word, with your use of the word illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
Makes it clear that in that moment, I'm not ascribing to your negative stereotype of a group of people. Okay? And again, you never know if is a student around you who heard that comment. Is another parent around? Also, you can't look at a person and determine what their status is. So you have no idea who in this group that's a personal story for. And so if nothing else, like that's why we say speak up against every biased remark every time. Now, I can't promise you that it's going to end very well, end very calmly. But at the end of the day, you can rest your head knowing you did what you're supposed to do. You did what was right. Now, a couple of other things with this scenario. For one, we like to tell folks, educating here because we tell people no person is illegal. Our actions are illegal. Something else you could educate on, well, you know, the word illegal doesn't apply to people. I think you're referencing people who are undocumented. Undocumented is a much more humanizing language to use in reference for a group of people who do not have the proper documentation to be here, right? This is a layered one because there's a lot of stuff inherent that isn't explicitly stated, but that's inherent in trying to do this. Like the cheaper labor, the devaluing of that labor and what people offer, like that's a skill. Now you've devalued it. You've devalued the person. And then, you know, sometimes in certain situations you need to say, actually, that's a racist comment. That's a racist thing to say. Now, I will tell you, most of the time we teach, we don't go in saying that that's a racist thing because it triggers all these other moments of deflection. But sometimes after you've paused and said, you know what, I'm uncomfortable with the use of that word. Or, well, you know, people aren't illegal, our actions are. And depending on how it is, like if someone's not getting it, you can go in with a lot more specific language and then talk about that. But that's a heavy one, and we're talking about bias. And we assume that the person who's saying it has good intentions, right? Because they're trying to help you out. But at the end of the day, our impact is greater than our intentions, because those harmful thoughts about that community can show up in other harmful ways, right? And so it's very important to pause and let that person know, you can't. I'm not a participant in this stereotypical way of viewing this group of people. Okay, thank y'all for sharing that. Margaret, what group, do you know what group number you all were? 1 or 3? 3, okay, well, how about group 3? You all go. What's the next scenario y'all did?
So we did during a staff meeting, some teachers cheer when the principal announced that students from nearby public housing will be attending a different school next year. So we expanded the role playing just a little bit. We had a principal and we had several teachers. The teachers that cheered, and then a teacher who found the cheering to be offensive. And that teacher jumped in right away and said, what did you say, Kellen?
I think I just said, it really makes me sad or really uncomfortable with the cheering, that these children aren't going to be coming to our school anymore. I think that's what I said.
Right.
Showing up as an interrupter in that moment. You standing up maybe in that space, in that board meeting, in that room. It makes me uncomfortable that we're cheering that these children won't be at our school anymore.
And then it was brought up that the principal could could say something about the teachers, but there would be some thought that you don't know what we're dealing with in our classrooms. And so it was really important that a teacher actually stood up. The teachers that had cheered were saying, well, you don't know how difficult this is. These kids come unprepared, they fall asleep, they, blah, 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 they're disruptive. But then it was pointed out that, that may be the fault of the parents, but you can't, those kids are there to be educated, and you can't put the fault of the home environment as their fault. I mean, that's out of their control, and we need to figure out ways to support them. And so the principal did come across and then say, what can I do to help you? What could we have done to help you support these children better?
So thank you. So at the tail end of that, what I hear is the principal leadership taking ownership to say, and I think I was in there in that session because the principal, who was played by Gladys, was kind of like, well, it sounds like we as a system should have better prepared you and equipped you to work with students in this community. So I want to pay attention to that, because that language removes the deficit lens on the children and their families. Because we don't want to blame children and their families, because we don't know everyone's home situation, right? And there's also kids who have 2-parent households, and they will come to school and turn it out, right? So we don't want to just blame people in a particular community for how kids are showing up, right? So one of the things that I always like to make clear, well, let me pause before I try to illuminate that, because I want some other folks, because I know another group had that scenario too, and just to see what they want to add to it. But I'm gonna come back to how do we recenter the children in that narrative. Another group did that one. Do y'all have anything you want to add?
April and Amelia and Jasmine and Minnie, we were all in group. What group were we? One? Group one.
You are.
We were in a group that did that scenario. So speak up if I leave something out, but I think our approach was initially the questioning approach, right? Should we be acting like that with our children? Should we be cheering that we won't have our children? What a terrible thing to do to our children or about our children. And then we got to the very singular pronouns, which this is what's written down, but I remember your comment before about using a more inclusive pronoun. But why would you do that? Like why would you cheer? Why would you cheer as opposed to why would we cheer? And then the echoing piece, the echoing strategy of hopefully somebody would speak up, right? And then being able to say, I agree, that's a terrible way to think about our kids, or what a hurtful thing to cheer about something that is so systemically racist, referring to public housing.
So I like how you made visible where this community comes from. This is connected to structural racism, right? Because oftentimes we like to label certain communities, and I see this in the chat box as well, Gladys, but not paying attention to how did they get in that environment in the first place? How were they in these types of home and these types of living situations in the first place, right? There's some structures there that were redlining, the history of working conditions, all of these things that contributed to where kids are coming from, right?
We had an interesting conversation in the group about, the question was, well, how would they know where they live? And we were talking a bit about, schools make maps. Schools know exactly where their kids live and use zip code and know what neighborhoods they live in, and then the assumptions that leads us to make on either side, right? Oh, you live in Preston Woods, oh, you must be this, or you live in public housing, oh, you must be this.
Right.
And, how that impacts then how staff and faculty perceive them.
Yeah, so some of the things that I want to make visible with this in particular, for one, there's a power dynamic at play too, right? Because the principal's running this meeting. And again, I always want us to challenge it to localize in our local context. The CEO is running the meeting, right? Oftentimes I have had people say, well, it's the principal's meeting, it's their job to speak up. It's the CEO is running the meeting, it's their job. What I always ask is, who heard it though? If you heard it, it's your responsibility. We're all culpable. We can't pass the buck. We call it passing the buck. You can't pass it to someone else and say, well, they were in charge, so that's on them. If we all heard it, then we all have a responsibility to show up in that moment. Glass, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I have a question because I wrote this down earlier before we did small breakout, bringing up the power imbalance. We assumed the principal would have challenged what they said, but the principal might have been clapping. And so what if you have to challenge someone that is in a position of authority over you and can retaliate against you? I've been in that situation, and like Salulupe talked about past lives where, yeah, you challenged it and all hell broke loose for you.
Yeah, and that's tough. There isn't one way to answer that question. I think at the end of the day, and I say this to myself too, like Rhonda, what are the risks here? Are you willing to do this? When you lay your head down at night, are you going to be satisfied with how you showed up, or are you not going to be satisfied? And that's where it goes back to Sabrina brought up, I'm saving myself. Like I have to think about, like, if this is going to cause me sickness because I didn't show up, then I might as well show up. Then I need to speak up in that moment, right? And I can't say every time you speak up that the outcome is going to be positive and work in your favor. But what I can say is that if the comment is wrong, we have a moral obligation to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves. I would hope that in that moment, when we disrupt, and that's why, depending on the environment, we do have to be thoughtful, right? So that now that the conversation isn't shifted to how you showed up, but that, you know, because people want to critique. Well, I'm gonna come back to that too. Critique how you advocated on behalf of marginalized communities, right? Or even yourself. But what I will say is that that's one of the reasons why we want to ask things that kind of de-escalate the situation. You know, why did we clap right now? Even though you didn't clap, don't be like, why did y'all clap? Like, y'all the bad teachers over there. Y'all the bad colleagues over there. Because at the end of the day, do you even know everyone who clapped? You didn't see everyone. We didn't see everyone. And plus, we have to take ownership. We are a staff. This is our school. So why did we clap in this moment? That's enough to disrupt that space. For now, some people who are going too fast, they're going to slow down and be like, why did we clap? And I like how in the other group, in Heather's group, there were some people who were like, because when I've taught kids from this neighborhood or who rode this bus route, these things happened. So one of the things I like to, because those narratives are real. One way to push back is, like, particularly if there's someone who has a relationship, to stand up and say, well, you know what? I taught Thomas, who lives in that neighborhood, and I'm going to miss Thomas. Humanize, bring it back to humanity, bring it back to a child. We're thinking about this inanimate neighborhood, bring it back to humanity, move from here to here. And now I've centered a child, the child that we're talking about. Thomas lives there, and he was in my class last year, or he was in my group, and I'm definitely gonna miss having Thomas in my class. And now we've made that human connection that we're gonna be losing. Our community is losing out on gifts and talents of the people in that space, right? Tallulah, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I just actually want to highlight something that Kellen did really, really well in the group. She played the role of one of the teachers, and she spoke up. And then at the end, she said, you know, I didn't really know I didn't know what to say. And I said, you know, I think it's important to speak up even when you don't know what to say, even if you don't have the right words, even if you don't know the whole history of it. If you just know this is wrong, you know, it's important to speak up in that space too. And sometimes it's more people that probably fit into that category. You know, I know this is wrong and I don't know how to react, but I know I need to address this. So I appreciate that she said that, because I think it's important.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It is. Sometimes you don't have all the right answers. You just know something's not right, and I want us to slow down and think about it. If you were a part of the implicit bias session I did with you all, we talked about biases come into play oftentimes when we're moving quickly and we're making these brash judgments. But when we make people slow down and process, oh wow, we did just clap. some people might not even recognize what they were participating in when they clapped, right? Anybody else want to add on to that one before we move on? And what was our last group that hadn't shared their at least one? I know you added on to other people's, but everybody hasn't shared their one. Was it group 3 or 1?
1.
Group 1, okay, group 1. If you're talking, you might be on mute. I don't know. And if not, we could just do another scenario. Who was in group 1? Raise your hand.
I think that was my group. Sorry, I stepped away from my. Sorry about that. So we did our role play on. So we did multiple. One we did on the teacher one as well, but then we also did ours on the Appendix 51, where it says you put students into groups, and over here, one turn to another and say, good, you can be our token Black. So
how did you all show up for that one?
So yeah, sorry, we showed up in the context where we asked the question to the student, what do you mean by token Black? And so I think it was Jasmine who brought up the fact that token Black is a historical term. So figuring out where did that child learn it from. And then we talked about
Can I pause 1 second? That's another question. Where did you learn about that term? Where did you learn about that joke? Who taught you that was funny? Those are types of questions that we can unearth. One of the things that I've told people, and I normally mention this, like when someone says something like that, it's particularly with a student or young kids, we actually advocate that you don't say that, that's racist, that's homophobic, that's sexist. We don't say that word. We actually say that, you shouldn't do that. We want to do things like Minnie suggested, ask a question, because if you do that, that shuts the kid down, and they may stop saying it around you, but they won't stop saying it. And you want to get what's underneath. Where did this come from? So that you can help now show up and educate. Oh, I see where you got this from, where you were communicating. Now let me tell you about, right? Because we don't want to shut them down. Although we do need to make it clear that the comment is problematic or whatever category it fits in. And then try to get underneath where it's coming from, because that's how we can change the behavior, the thoughts, and the such. Go ahead, Minnie, I'll let you finish.
Okay, and then we just had a discussion there how basically token Black, you're kind of like objectifying the student, that person, kind of putting them in an insignificant type of atmosphere. And then you popped in and gave us a good question and talking about in what role do we support that student. And so we talked about, I think April was the one that said it. She made a good point of apologizing to the student and making the other student apologize to the student that received the BR token Black, because I guess in that moment, the student feels as if it's their fault for receiving that. And you kind of want to build that environment where, they're supported and they feel acknowledged about what happened. So we talked about that, and then I think we talked about just supporting in general and like figuring out how they feel towards that statement that was directed to them. So yeah.
Anybody else want to add on to that scenario or thoughts?
Oh, one more thing. And then Betsy, we kind of like went off a little bit, but then Betsy asked about microaggressions. So then we kind of went on the topic of what is a microaggression, how it's subtle, how it's basically in forms of your own biases and prejudice against a target. And then we kind of like dive into a little discussion on that as well.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. Some of the language I want to make visible to you all. Who is thinking about who's the perpetrator, the person causing, the harmful comment, and who's the victim, right? Oftentimes in those situations, you want to affirm and support the person who was that target of that discrimination, right? It looks different. There's no one way to show up. Like, we have to know our community, whatever job it is, again, whether it's the board meeting or the classroom, we need to know our community and recognize that whoever the target was, we need to check in with them. Sometimes, like when you center the child, you can do it in the moment, or you may want to later on ask them to step outside or follow up with a colleague outside of that space and just ask them, how are you? How did you feel when you heard that? You can also ask, are you okay with how I try to advocate in that moment? Is there something else you want me to do? Because I'll do it. Oftentimes when working with young kids, they don't want any more attention than what already came to them, because that awkwardness, they want to be included, and trying to address that comment makes them feel like an outsider too. So that's why it's important to have those relationships. But follow up with the kids. Sometimes I've had kids who are like, I don't want you to say anything else. I'm good. Those are my friends. Right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. We made another point. I think it was Amelia who was saying that take the child aside, because they're already like focusing on that moment, just to piggyback off what you said, but just like take them aside and put them like on a one-on-one type of thing. So it doesn't feel like they're just this target in front of a mass audience, that they're just, you're giving them that one attention.
So they were already called a token. Now all the eyes are on them. And if you're thinking about this from a child's perspective, that's not the type of attention they want, right? And it's okay. You still have to show up in that moment though. The goal is still to show up in that moment. Afterwards, when it's died down a little bit, pull the child to the side. Are you okay with how I showed up? How are you? How did that make you feel? Is there something else you would like for me to do? Right? So I'll give you an example. I had a kid who was at a Montessori school, predominantly white, a Black child, and they were outside on the playground, and a white child called the Black child an N-word while they were playing football. All right, so the school knows I do this work. I've done work with them before. They called me in to say, okay, how do we handle this? I said, well, first what you need to do is check in with the child and the parent, the target of the discrimination, the Black child, and ask them what it is that they want. The child was like, I don't want you to bring this up. I don't want you to talk about it. And I said, we have to respect that child and what they want. And you still have to address this, because the other kids were on the playground, they heard it too. And if we don't address it, we're going to affirm whiteness and white superiority and white supremacy. And we're also going to affirm inferiority for Black and brown, that their pain didn't matter. This was nothing, right? So we had to be very thoughtful about how we showed up. And so what we did, I went in and did a lesson on language and power and words. And then we did a lesson on talking about N-word and racial slurs. We didn't single that kid out. We still had that necessary conversation. And if the kid had wanted to be involved, I would have involved them, but we didn't single that child out. But that class still had that very necessary conversation without having to re-traumatize the child who was that target of that discrimination. And we did check in with the parent and told them what we were gonna do, right? So that was just very important for us to do that. And again, you can always follow up. We have to prioritize the child. Oftentimes what I hear people say is, well, I didn't want to make the person, the perpetrator, well, I didn't want to make them uncomfortable. I didn't want to call them out in front of everybody. And what I tell folks is, whose pain are we prioritizing? Whose pain are we prioritizing? The victim, the one that was the target of the discrimination, or the person who perpetrated it? No, we cannot, whose pain are we prioritizing? And we have to show up on behalf of the person that was most marginalized in that moment. Let me ask you this one real quick before we get ready to close out. Did anyone do appendix that's on page 51? A teacher criticizes a girl about her earrings. Don't you realize that those look ghetto? Did anybody do that one?
We talked about it a little bit, and we kind of hinted at towards microaggressions. So then, yeah. So
I will say, if y'all didn't do that one, you definitely need, maybe in your own workspaces, go back and as a staff walk through that, because that's layered. Your race and identity, the person who overhears it, your race and identity matters, how you show up. Let's say if it's mixed race, a child and a teacher of different races, it changes if the child and the teacher are of the same race. The context does matter. And our identities that we carry into that space and how we negotiate power All of those things matter. So I encourage you to walk through that one. That's a tricky one to deal with, but it's something that happens to Black girls all the time. If it's not our names, it's our hair. If it's not our hair, it's our earrings. If it's not our earrings, it's our clothes, right? And we have to be able to show up as advocates on behalf of Black girls when situations like that happen, even if it's the same race grouping.
Rhonda,
Right.
and sometimes it's even Black girls' bodies.
Yes.
Because, yeah, things that they cannot take on and off.
Right. One of the things, and we're not going to have time to go into it, but one of the things to make visible is that as adults, we probably shouldn't be commenting on girls' bodies, period, or anyone's body. If you're not giving a compliment, you look great. I love your hair. Any type of critiques of another person's body, hopefully we don't have them, but if nothing else, they should stay in our heads. And if we hear someone else doing that, you have to say something. We have to speak up. We have to center the child. Even if that child is friends with a teacher, they have a good relationship. Now that does matter though, right? But at the end of the day, I tell people most girls and most Black girls don't show up on a day-to-day basis hoping someone describes a part of their body as ghetto. Even if they laughed it off, even if they didn't show that they were hurt, that wasn't used in a way as a compliment, right? But it's layered. And I do think that's something that you all should follow up with. A couple of things that I want to make visible for you all. These are just some scenarios. You all have your own. It is important. I think you should keep practicing it. Keep practicing for yourself too, because there's going to be a next time. Some of y'all, when you get off this call, you're going to go somewhere and somebody's going to say something and you're going to have to put your skills to use right away. But be prepared. I have some go-to phrases that as soon as I'm triggered, I'm ready, because now I've taken the time I've had them similar occurrences so often that now I'm better prepared for how I want to show up. Something that I said at the Educator Institute that Sabrina brought up in our small breakout group. For Black and brown folks, we get tired of having to educate people. It should not be our job. Folks should know. Like we should know, like that is a weight, that is a stress that we carry in our bodies. And so one of the things that I had to come to terms with is that me being tired and fed up and not want to educate folks, particularly white people, doesn't stop me from having racist encounters. So I said to myself, Rhonda, how are you going to save yourself in this moment so that you feel when you walk away, you don't have that tension headache, right? So I had to say, in this moment, it's not about educating you or the other person. It's about saving myself. Because I'm going to feel better about myself if I knew I stood up for what I believed. If I knew when my body triggered me, I responded. And however that person responds, whether they get it or not, I am not responsible for their reaction to their own biases. That is not my fault. As a person I love being a kind person. And I hate being mean to people. And I gotta tell them, you're not being mean, Rhonda. You're advocating for yourself. Like that's really hard. But at the end of the day, I have to save myself. And I have to push back and say, no. I want you to think about what you just said to me. And hopefully you don't carry that forward and mistreat someone else. Another key point I want to say is that sometimes people need to be called out. As I've taught you these 4 ways of showing up, I don't want us to go and judge someone who may not have come in calmly and asked you a question, Khalid. Someone who maybe didn't show up very kindly, Margaret, and tried to educate you. I want to call it like respectability politics. We don't get to judge how other people respond to the oppression we caused. Somebody might show up with an attitude. Somebody might show up with some profanity. Somebody might show up with some anger. We don't get to judge that person because we don't know their story. We don't know what they went through. And so I don't want you to leave from here and then have an encounter and say, Rhonda taught us to ask a question. I need you to ask me a question. We don't get to do that. And that is not what I'm advocating for. All right. We don't get to judge people. What I like to encourage folks, because sometimes it's going to be us. We're the ones who cause the harm. We need to listen to understand, not to respond. We need to show up with some humility, apologize, and reconcile. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing it out to me. I should have known. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. How can I make this better? Don't judge the person for how they show up. I tell people, you might not always get a palatable Rhonda. Do something to one of my kids. I might not have any questions for you. Okay? So, I mean, that's just real. And oftentimes, again, Black and brown folks, we get judged for how we respond to other people's oppression. And you forget, but what triggered it? What was the racist comment that made me show up like this? Because you don't know my story, right? So I want to be very clear that we're not judging people for how they show up. Everybody might not have the wherewithal and the calmness to pull you in, to pull us in, okay? So I just want to make sure that I'm very clear. Any last comments before we get ready to close out? Or questions?
I'm sorry, I'm pushing buttons. I'm in the doctor's office. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, this was amazing training. And because this training exists, obviously things are very different from when I was working 11 years ago. Because that training was, it encouraged people to address something if it was blatant, and that if you could manage it, and basically to choke on it. And you know, everything is being renamed now. I shared with Margaret probably less than a month ago. I was like, Margaret, you know, I carried that torch and I believed in the diversity awareness. And I know I was hyped for all of 6 years. Whenever I was like, okay, when we gonna start doing something other than awareness? Because we're aware now. And then I became sensitive to the word tolerant. I'm like, why am I teaching y'all to be tolerant, to tolerate me? So in things being named, renamed, I shared with Margaret about a month ago. I have issue with that. I shouldn't teach you to be tolerant of me, because tolerant is negative for me. And it took a while for me to wake up and go, you know, I shouldn't be tolerated in a work environment. I should be welcomed in a work environment. And I literally served as the diversity representative for a huge organization and then a small one, and went through that evolution while carrying that title. But this training is very similar to what we did, but this is combative. It would be described as combative with what I did earlier, but it's not combative. It's direct, and it's calling what is. And thank you for sharing, and I really appreciate the training. And I told the PA that, you know, I needed to dust off some skills and I needed to be retrained. And Margaret got me in the REI, and I wasn't even feeling well that weekend, and I would not miss. It was amazing. And this again was amazing. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Heather, so much. I want to point out, I forgot, I normally say this. If you all recall, I said this came from the Teaching Tolerance organization. When they first came out, I wouldn't read their stuff because I didn't like the title of the organization. I said, I don't want to be, same thing Heather said, I don't want to be tolerated, and I don't want to read none of your stuff. And then people kept sending me things from them. And so I actually read through it, and I was like, well, you know what? I'm gonna make that visible, this word tolerate, because we should be welcomed. I love how you said that.
Well, the Redskins, they're gonna change that logo. So it's not absurd for them to reconsider renaming.
It is. You know, I might show up now and send them that email. Like, now that you have more understanding, more years, they put out great material. We don't want to be tolerated. Rethink that title. And I imagine there's a lot of people out there who feel the same way.
And it wasn't immediate. It was slow. I mean, and whenever I realized that I was excited about being the diversity rep for a huge company, and as it started to wear off, it took a long time to wear off. And I was like, you know what? I shouldn't be tolerated at work nor at home.
You should enjoy my company. If not, there needs to be some changes, and with some changes at home too. But
as I give you one more, I always keep saying one more thing, I keep forgetting. If you want to type in the chat box anything about how you're feeling, what thoughts do you have? Did you have any aha moments? Were any of your beliefs or assumptions challenged from this presentation? If you want to type that in the chat box. The last thing that I want to say is, oh man, it just went out of my head. Oh, whenever you show up, you need to know what your goal is. That's something else that helped me rethink, like, what is my goal in speaking up here? And I push back every time. If your goal is to change that person's mind, you might run yourself into the ground trying to do it. It's just, if your goal is to make it known that I'm not okay with this, then you can definitely achieve that every time. That doesn't mean we shouldn't change people's mind. It's contextual. I don't know whose mind you're trying to change, but a lot of people are stuck in their ways, and that's just the reality. And so when I go into a situation, I'm not going in trying to win an argument. I'm not going in trying to change anyone's mind. I'm going in to say, I do not agree with this, and I'm going to make it be known, and I'm going to disrupt this power right here that you're trying to leverage. That is my goal. I'm going to make it known that this is not okay. And that's my goal. And every time I speak up, I achieve my goal. So you all have to, what is your goal when you show up? If your goal is to be heard, that's fine. That could be your goal. If your goal, and even if your goal, even if you're enraged, if your goal is just to shout out what you need to shout out, then you do that, right? And I say that in particular for people of color, like, because we get enraged, like, this is deep for us, right? And sometimes our goal is just, I just need to say what I need to say. And other times our goal is, I just need to make this known, let my colleague know that this is how this is what's bothering me. So again, make sure, what is your goal? What do you want the outcome to be when you show up? And I always encourage those of us who identify as white, those of you who identify as white, you have to step up and take some ownership and pushing back in ways that maybe you had not done before. Thank you all so much. Take a few minutes to read through the comment thread over here. I appreciate your time and attention. I'm going to turn it back over to Minnie so that she can close out. Our contact information is down on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me, to us, if you want to learn more. But thank you all.
Let's give
thank you.
Big virtual round of applause for Dr. Bullock. Amazing as always. We appreciate you so much, Dr. Bullock. You have no idea. Like, we always learn something new, a different perspective, a different outlook that we're going to use throughout. I know me personally, I'm going to use throughout my time and how I'm going to show up in my roles and my spaces. So I'm actually going to piggy this off to Tulupe, and I think she's going to talk about, or maybe it's Khalid.
So I'll go first before we transition. I just want to give you guys some brief updates. I want to encourage you all to head over to our website, stay up to date on future events, and also if you haven't had the opportunity to create your organizational profile, there's still time to do that. We aren't blocking anyone from submitting their organizational profiles. We actually have a search engine which we have designed to allow organizations to better collaborate with one another in the community. Secondly, that is a great way, like I said, to stay up to date. We have an event calendar on there. Also been utilizing a pop-up feature that we have